Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a time when what you put on your plate could be considered not just bad manners, but morally questionable. So dim the lights, settle in, and let your mind wander softly into the kitchens, dining halls, and monasteries of medieval Europe. Imagine flickering candlelight illuminating wooden tables, the smell of roasting meat mixing with herbs, and the faint, ever-present undertone of suspicion that eating the wrong thing or at the wrong time might lead not just to an upset stomach, but to spiritual disfavor. Medieval people were very conscious of sin, not in the abstract, distant sense, but in the very immediate physical sense, what they ate, when they ate it, and how much of it could affect their souls. Gluttony, of course, was one of the 7 deadly sins, and gluttony, surprisingly, was not just about eating too much, it was about indulgence, choice, and desire. To eat delicacies for pleasure alone rather than necessity was to flirt with damnation, and so medieval tables were battlegrounds of morality as much as sustenance. Let's begin with meat, which was surprisingly controversial. Meat itself was often restricted to specific days or social classes. Monks, for example, were forbidden from eating meat on most days, and fish was preferred, not for its taste, but for its spiritual symbolism. Even the nobility observed these rules, though with far more flexibility. Eating a lavish roast on a forbidden day could provoke whispers, scolding, or, if a pious observer happened to be nearby, quiet judgment. And yet, the desire for roasted, succulent meat rarely subsided. It is human, after all, to want what is tempting, even when morally questionable. Fish, in contrast, was considered virtuous, or at least morally safer. But even here, rules were precise. Certain fish were more acceptable than others. Eating the wrong species on the wrong day could be considered indulgent or sinful. And not all fish were easy to come by, which added a subtle tension. Scarcity, morality, and appetite intersected in ways that made even a simple meal a matter of careful reflection. Dairy products, too, carried moral weight. Cheese and butter were abundant in some regions, but overindulgence could be sinful. Eating cheese purely for pleasure rather than nourishment might provoke guilt. Milk, when consumed excessively, was sometimes considered the food of the lazy, a bodily indulgence rather than a necessary sustenance. And desserts, sweetened with honey or dried fruits, were particularly suspect. Sugars were rare and expensive, so consuming them freely was both indulgent and socially conspicuous. Spices, meanwhile, walked a fine line. Exotic, imported, and expensive, spices were considered luxurious. To season a dish heavily was to flaunt wealth and desire, a subtle sin in a society where moderation was a virtue. Cinnamon, cloves, and pepper could transform a simple pottage into a sensory experience bordering on indulgence, and indulgence, naturally, was frowned upon. Monks, clergy, and even cautious nobles measured spices as much as they measured moral risk. And let's not forget mealtime timing, which was morally regulated in surprising ways. Certain foods were forbidden during fasting periods, such as Lent, Advent, or Ember Days. Breaking these fasts, even unintentionally, could be a minor moral transgression. Imagine a simple loaf of bread or a piece of fish consumed a day too early, and the quiet guilt that might follow, tempered only by prayer or penance. Food in medieval Europe was never merely sustenance, it was a reflection of virtue, discipline, and spiritual vigilance. Honeyed treats, pies, and pastries were particularly tricky. Sweetness was a luxury and often considered morally suspect if consumed for pleasure alone. Cakes made with sugar, almonds, or fruit might be reserved for festivals, religious celebrations, or the tables of the wealthy. Eating such items casually, outside their proper context, could be considered a sin of excess, and yet they were deeply tempting, naturally, for both nobles and commoners with access. Human nature, unchanged, was always drawn toward sweetness. Even alcohol carried moral weight. Wine was frequently used in religious rituals and was considered virtuous when consumed moderately, particularly by those who were otherwise pious. Beer, ale, and mead were staples in daily life, but overconsumption, predictably, was sinful. And yet, for ordinary people, liquid calories sometimes were more sustaining than food itself. There was, as always, a tension between necessity, indulgence, and morality. Interestingly, what counted as sinful could vary by region, social class, and even local custom.
A dish acceptable in a wealthy French court might be frowned upon in an Italian monastery. Regional preferences, availability, and cultural norms all intertwined with religious doctrine, creating a subtle and complex moral landscape around something as ordinary as eating.
Despite these restrictions, humans found ways to enjoy food quietly, creatively, and sometimes mischievously. A monk might savor a piece of cheese in secret. A noble could disguise indulgence under layers of ritual or ceremony. And everyday people, without wealth or status, often skirted these rules unconsciously, driven more by hunger and survival than moral calculation. The tension between desire, morality, and practicality shaped bodies and minds alike, creating a slow, gentle rhythm that defined life in medieval Europe. And so, as we drift toward the evening, it becomes clear that the simple act of eating was never simple at all. Each bite carried moral, social, and spiritual weight. Bodies were tested not just by hunger, illness, or physical labor, but by the careful negotiation between appetite and virtue. Meals were rituals, indulgences were sins, and human desire persisted, quietly persistent, beneath layers of etiquette and doctrine. Next, we will meander into the more unusual and forbidden foods, delicacies so rare or strange that consuming them was almost guaranteed to provoke moral reflection, scandal, or even whispered horror. But for now, let us linger in the gentle, measured rhythm of daily medieval meals. Bread, pottage, fish, and a touch of honeyed sweetness, all consumed with care, awareness, and the quiet tension of a morally conscious world. As we continue our slow journey through the kitchens and dining halls of medieval Europe, let us imagine for a moment the rarer, more luxurious foods, those that inspired both delight and guilt. These were the items that could transform an ordinary meal into a feast, a simple dinner into a quiet moral dilemma. Candied fruits, exotic spices, and imported delicacies were rare, expensive, and morally suspect, for their consumption often signaled indulgence rather than necessity. Take, for instance, spiced meats. Nobles had access to cuts of beef, venison, and sometimes even more unusual fare, all prepared with lavish spices imported from distant lands. Cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves were prized not merely for their flavor, but for their rarity. To eat them casually was to flaunt wealth and, by extension, risk a gentle moral censure. A king savoring a peppered venison roast might delight in the taste, while quietly reminding himself that the church frowned on such indulgence. Then there were sweet delicacies, sugared almonds, marzipan, and honeyed pastries. Sugar was a luxury, often imported from far-off lands, and consuming it freely was considered indulgent, even sinful if done for pleasure alone. Nuns and monks were particularly strict about this, seeing sweetness as a temptation of the flesh, a subtle whisper of gluttony disguised as enjoyment. One imagines the quiet thrill of sneaking a sugared treat from a monastery pantry, a tiny rebellion against fasting rules and moral vigilance. Exotic fruits were another temptation. Citrus fruits, pomegranates, and dates were rare, expensive, and often brought by traders from the Mediterranean or the Middle East. Their appearance on a dining table signaled prestige, power, and, quietly, indulgence. A slice of orange, while delightful, might also provoke reflection. Am I enjoying this for sustenance or simply for pleasure? The answer, often, leaned towards pleasure, and therefore towards a minor moral transgression. Seafood, too, could be both virtuous and perilous. Salted herring or cod was acceptable and often eaten during fasting days, but delicacies like lobster, crab, or freshwater eel were luxurious and morally ambiguous. To consume such fare on a day reserved for abstinence might provoke whispers or require confession, and yet the human desire for variety and novelty often outweighed doctrinal caution. Hunger, after all, is patient, but indulgence is persistent. Interestingly, food presentation carried moral weight as well. Elaborate feasts, with meats carved into intricate shapes, pies baked with surprise fillings, or sugar molded into fantastical designs, were admired aesthetically but also critiqued morally. Excessive decoration could be seen as indulgent, a subtle flirtation with vanity.
A well-decorated banquet table was beautiful, yes, but it was also a potential temptation, testing the virtue of all who partook. And then, of course, there were the regional peculiarities. In some areas, the consumption of certain animals was considered sinful or unlucky. Swans, for example, were royal delicacies, but commoners were forbidden from eating them, sometimes under threat of severe punishment. Eating swan outside these constraints was not just illegal, it was morally transgressive. Similarly, eels, frogs, and dormice appeared on tables as delicacies, yet their consumption carried an unspoken tension, part culinary curiosity, part moral risk. Fasting periods naturally magnified all these tensions. Lent, Advent, and Ember Days imposed restrictions on both meat and rich foods. The body, trained to desire sustenance, faced moral restrictions. Monks might subsist on bread, water, and vegetables, occasionally succumbing to small indulgences in secret. Nobles, aware of their visibility, sometimes bent the rules creatively. Fish cooked in luxurious sauces, or small amounts of meat disguised under layers of herbs and seasoning. Human ingenuity, even in moral restraint, is quietly impressive. The fascinating aspect of medieval food morality is the blending of physical and spiritual experience. Hunger, indulgence, and morality were intertwined. To eat too much, too richly, or too freely was both physically taxing and spiritually risky. To deny oneself entirely was virtuous, but often exhausting. To find the balance required subtle awareness, patience, and occasionally a touch of cunning. The human body and human desire were never entirely obedient, even in the most disciplined monasteries or the grandest castles. And yet, humans found joy in this delicate balance. Tiny indulgences, an extra pinch of sugar, a rare slice of meat, a well-seasoned fish were celebrated quietly. Feasts, when permissible, became occasions not just of nutrition, but of careful pleasure, shared socially and morally responsibly. The human body, enduring hunger, fasting, and minor transgressions, persisted, finding both sustenance and delight in the same bite. As we drift toward the evening, it is worth reflecting on this slow rhythm, the negotiation between body, appetite, and moral expectation. Medieval Europe teaches us that even ordinary acts, eating bread, sipping wine, tasting a rare fruit, carry weight, subtly shaping both body and soul. Hunger was constant, indulgence occasional, and moral reflection never far from the table. Next, we will meander into the daily diets of peasants versus nobles, exploring how scarcity, abundance, and morality combine to shape bodies and lives. We will see how physical endurance, social hierarchy, and moral expectation intertwined in ways that are quietly fascinating, sometimes amusing, and always human.
And morally suspect, for it symbolized indulgence, excess, and social hierarchy. One can imagine the subtle envy or moral reflection of a peasant eyeing a noble's loaf while quietly accepting the sustenance of their own coarse meal. Vegetables and legumes played a key role in the peasant diet, but these were not always pleasant to eat. Cabbage, beans, and onions were nutritious and filling, but also prone to causing digestive discomfort. And yet, they were consumed diligently because survival required it. Meals were eaten slowly, quietly, and with awareness. The body had to extract maximum sustenance from every bite because tomorrow's labor demanded it. Meat, when available, was rare. A roasted chicken or pork leg might appear only for festivals, celebrations, or special occasions, and when it did appear, it was shared carefully with etiquette and portioning that reflected both scarcity and social awareness. Fish, particularly freshwater varieties, was more common and often eaten on fasting days when meat was forbidden. The human body, flexible and enduring, adapted to these limitations with remarkable resilience. Nobles, by contrast, lived in abundance. Banquets, feasts, and carefully prepared meals were part of daily life, though not without moral oversight. Excessive indulgence could be sinful, as we explored, but the sheer quantity and variety of food were remarkable. Multiple courses, rare meats, spiced sauces, imported fruits and delicate pastries. Nobles were expected to enjoy these meals with decorum, to eat slowly, and to avoid overindulgence, though human nature, unchanged across centuries, often complicated this. Interestingly, both peasants and nobles were shaped by similar rhythms, though in vastly different ways. Hunger, scarcity, indulgence, and ritual governed the body's response. Peasants endured chronic scarcity, building resilience in quiet endurance. Nobles endured moral expectation, ceremonial obligation, and sometimes overabundance, learning restraint, or, occasionally, the consequences of gluttony. In both cases, the human body remained remarkably adaptable, quietly negotiating the balance between survival, pleasure, and expectation. Fasting days created further divergence. Peasants observed them irregularly, as survival often overrode ritual, but nobles, monks, and clergy adhered strictly, at least publicly. Abstinence from meat, dairy, and sometimes even oil tested both willpower and ingenuity. Fish, grains, and vegetables became the focus, and meals were measured, prepared, and consumed with moral attention. The rhythm of fasting shaped not only appetite, but also daily routine, work, and social interaction. And yet, even in scarcity or restraint, humans found small pleasures. A rare piece of honey, a slice of fruit, or a carefully roasted leg of meat became a moment of delight, quietly savored. Meals were not only about survival, they were about the subtle enjoyment of life's small gifts, even when layered with moral reflection or social expectation. The body, as always, adapted, enduring hunger, fasting, or indulgence with quiet resilience. It is fascinating, too, to consider how physical labor affected diet. Peasants walked, bent, lifted, and worked for hours, their bodies demanding steady nourishment. Meals were functional, eaten quickly when possible, often supplemented with small snacks, nuts, bread, or cheese to maintain energy. Nobles, by contrast, exercised less, but were expected to present themselves gracefully, a different kind of physical demand that required balance, posture, and the occasional restraint from overindulgence. Despite these differences, a common thread runs through all medieval dining: awareness of the body. Every bite, every sip, every meal was shaped by a combination of necessity, desire, social expectation, and moral reflection. Hunger was a teacher, indulgence a temptation, and survival a constant negotiation between body, environment, and human will. As we drift gently toward the next section, we will explore the moral and social consequences of indulgence, famine, and gluttony, tracing how medieval people thought about sin, health, and the enduring relationship between body and morality. We will see how desire, scarcity, and spiritual vigilance intertwined, shaping both the rhythm of daily life and the slow endurance of the human body. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back again, back into medieval Europe, where the bread was heavy, the winters were longer than anyone deserved, and the human body was treated like an inconvenient rumor. So settle in, dim the lights, let your thoughts slow down.
Because tonight, we're talking about hunger. Not the modern kind, where you forget lunch and become mildly dramatic by 3 p.m. No, medieval hunger was different. It was constant. It was quiet. It was built into the structure of life. And naturally, they made it worse. Because medieval society didn't just see hunger as a problem, they saw it as a message, a warning, sometimes even a punishment. And if you were starving, well, perhaps God was simply having a moment. In medieval Europe, famine was not rare. It wasn't an unusual catastrophe. It was more like an unwelcome season that returned whenever it felt like it. Bad harvest? Famine. Too much rain? Famine. Not enough rain? Also famine. Locusts? Famine. War? Famine with extra inconvenience. The medieval world was balanced on a thin line of agricultural luck, and most people lived one failed crop away from misery. And the body always knew.
The body noticed first. The stomach tightened, the energy disappeared. Children became smaller, adults became thinner, and the village simply adjusted, quietly, because what else could we do? You could not order food from somewhere else. There was no supply chain. There was only the field, and whatever it decided to give you. The strange thing is how quickly hunger became normal. A peasant might eat bread and onions for weeks, maybe some beans, maybe cabbage, and then when even that ran out, they ate less, and then less again. Medieval people became experts in endurance. They knew what it meant to stretch food, to water down soup until it became an idea, to chew slowly, not because it was enjoyable, but because it made the meal last longer. And hunger became a kind of background noise, a companion, like mud or taxes, or the knowledge that your teeth were slowly betraying you. And above all this was the moral layer, because medieval Christianity had a complicated relationship with food. Food was necessary, but enjoying it too much was suspicious. Wanting food was human, but wanting it eagerly was dangerous. The medieval mind lived in constant tension. Hunger was suffering, but suffering was holy. So famine could be tragic, but also spiritually useful, which is, frankly, a very medieval way to look at starvation. Gluttony, after all, was one of the 7 deadly sins. Not murder, not cruelty, not exploitation, but eating too much bread. Naturally. And gluttony wasn't just about overeating. It was about desire, about wanting, about letting the body lead instead of the soul. The medieval world feared appetite, not because food was bad, but because the body was always trying to pull you downward, toward pleasure, toward softness, toward cake. And cake, as we know, was basically the gateway drug to hell. Monks wrote endlessly about controlling hunger. Saints were praised for fasting until they were barely alive. Some holy women survived, supposedly, on nothing but the Eucharist, which is spiritually impressive and physically concerning. But medieval people admired restraint. The less you needed, the closer you were to God. The more you wanted, the more human you were. And being human was considered a bit embarrassing. But famine didn't care about theology. Famine arrived anyway. And when it did, the rules bent. People ate things they were never meant to eat. Roots, bark, grass, even animals that were normally forbidden. Cats, dogs, sometimes worse. And the chroniclers, of course, wrote about it with horror. Not always horror at the suffering, but horror at the collapse of proper order. Because medieval society feared chaos more than pain. Pain was expected. Chaos was unacceptable. And while peasants starved quietly, the elites often continued eating. Not always in extravagance, but in safety. Because nobles had stores. They had grain reserves. They had access. They had protection. And famine revealed what medieval hierarchy always meant. Some bodies were allowed to endure. Others were allowed to break. And this was simply normal. Royal courts still held banquets even during hard years. The dishes became symbolic, a performance of stability, a way of saying the kingdom is fine, even when it clearly wasn't. A king might eat roasted swan while villages nearby boiled weeds, and no one thought this was strange. It was order. It was hierarchy. It was medieval life. Of course, nobles also suffered from indulgence. Their bodies weren't exactly thriving. Overeating, rich foods, heavy wines. It led to gout, swelling, digestive misery. And medieval medicine naturally responded with bloodletting, because if your foot hurts, clearly the solution is to remove some blood. Kings were often sickly, bloated, pale, constipated, and still called things like the Magnificent. One ruler might be nicknamed the Fair, while resembling a mildly confused turnip wrapped in velvet, but no one said that aloud, because royalty was sacred, even when it was visibly struggling with its own dinner. And then there was the issue of famine politics, because hunger wasn't just physical, it was dangerous. Starving people get restless, they get angry, they stop being obedient, and medieval rulers feared that deeply. Food scarcity wasn't just suffering, it was instability. A hungry population was unpredictable, which meant famine could lead to revolt,
or crime, or inconvenient demands for change. So rulers tried to control grain. They imposed price laws. They punished hoarding. Sometimes they even distributed bread publicly, not out of kindness, but out of survival. A king feeding the poor was not always charity. Sometimes it was crowd control. And in all of this, the body endured, quietly, always. The body became smaller, weaker, marked by scarcity. Children died young. Adults aged quickly. Teeth rotted. Skin broke. And hunger shaped everything, even personality, even faith, even love. Because when survival is uncertain, everything else becomes secondary. And yet, medieval people still celebrated food, still longed for it, still found joy in it when they could. A feast day after famine was overwhelming. A harvest after hardship was sacred. A slice of meat was not casual. It was meaningful. It was life. It was warmth. Even in a world that feared pleasure, food remained one of the few comforts that could still break through, even briefly, even quietly. So as we drift onward, we begin to see medieval life clearly. The body was always hungry.
The soul was always guilty. The elites were always eating. The poor were always enduring. And everyone, in their own way, was trying not to want too much, because wanting in medieval Europe was dangerous. In the next part, we'll drift into something even stranger: the medieval obsession with filth, cleanliness, disease, and the daily discomfort of simply existing inside a human body. Because hunger was only the beginning. The medieval body was not just underfed, it was unwashed, uncomfortable, and constantly reminded that it was temporary. Hey everyone! Tonight we continue drifting back, this time to a world where the human body was often considered an inconvenience. Because medieval Europe had a complicated relationship with cleanliness. It's not that people didn't care, they did, or at least they thought they did. But understanding of germs, bacteria, and infection was minimal. So the body, always hungry, fragile, and often in discomfort, was left to its own devices. Bathing was infrequent, really infrequent. The average person might wash a few times a year, sometimes only when they changed clothes. This wasn't laziness, it was a combination of superstition, effort, and the ever-present fear of water carrying illness. Monks in monasteries, despite their discipline, sometimes went weeks without full bathing. Nobles might bathe more, but often in the most ceremonial rather than hygienic fashion. Clothing likewise could be a problem. Layers of wool, linen, and silk were worn constantly. Wool absorbed sweat, linen stained easily, and changing garments was laborious. So humans lived close to their own odors and everyone else's, all day, every day. This wasn't considered shocking, it was normal. Quietly enduring your own smell was just part of life. And naturally, where there is filth, there is disease. Plagues, fevers, dysentery, and smallpox were common. People were weak, ill, or recovering more often than we might imagine. Yet, they carried on. The body adapted. The human organism is quietly resilient. Medical advice, such as it was, often focused on balancing humors. Bloodletting, purging, and herbal concoctions were the standard. Sometimes they helped. Sometimes they made things worse. Sometimes they caused quiet panic. And the body, as always, endured. The streets themselves added to the challenge. Waste was tossed from windows. Animals wandered freely. Water sources were often contaminated. Every step outside carried invisible risks. And yet, humans persisted, walking, working, and living in close proximity to this slow chaos. Even within households, filth was unavoidable. Kitchens were smoky and greasy. Chickens, pigs, and goats might live nearby. Human waste was often collected in the yard to be used later as fertilizer. So the body,
constantly in contact with danger, adapted, tolerated, and survived. This also shaped perception. Sickness, odor, or frailty were often seen as moral or spiritual reflections. If you were weak, diseased, or smelly, it might be considered a sign of sin or laziness or divine displeasure. And when you added hunger to the mix, the body became both vulnerable and morally scrutinized. Yet, amidst all this discomfort, people found strategies to cope. Herbs were worn, sprinkled, or steeped. Smoke was used to purify spaces. Clothing was aired and layered strategically. Rituals of washing hands before meals or rubbing certain oils on the skin offered a semblance of control, and the human body endured. Childhood, in particular, was difficult. Children were weak, prone to illness, and expected to survive with minimal intervention. Education, labor, and play all demanded endurance. Yet, children adapted, as they always do, developing resilience, quick reflexes, and an astonishing tolerance for discomfort. Meanwhile, adults, both peasant and noble, faced their own slow battles. The combination of diet, filth, labor, and disease made daily life a quiet negotiation with the body. A king might suffer from gout, indigestion, and obesity simultaneously. A peasant might endure chronic undernourishment, exhaustion, and skin infections. And yet, all continued, with remarkable persistence. Even mental strain was physical. Stress from famine, social hierarchy, and moral obligation translated into fatigue, headaches, and tension. The medieval body absorbed all of this quietly, without complaint. And history, thankfully, preserved these subtle endurance stories. So, as we drift toward the next section, it's clear. The medieval body was never neutral. It was a site of struggle. It was fragile, resilient, and often absurdly inconvenient. Hunger, filth, disease, and moral expectation all intertwined to create a daily life that demanded patience, ingenuity, and quiet courage. Next, we will meander into the consequences of dynastic choices on bodies, exploring inbreeding, fragile heirs, and the slow, almost comical endurance of royal physiques over generations. Because if peasant bodies were struggling quietly, royal bodies were struggling flamboyantly. Hey everyone! Tonight we continue our journey into medieval life, shifting from peasant endurance to the peculiar fragility of royal bodies. Because while commoners quietly struggled, the elite often suffered in more conspicuous ways. Dynastic marriages, as we've gently explored before, were never about love. They were contracts, alliances, and, often unintentionally, experiments in genetics. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, sometimes siblings married cousins. And the human body, with its charming unpredictability, frequently reminded everyone that nature doesn't much care for politics. Take Charles II of Spain, for example, a king whose life seems almost tailor-made for historians to chuckle softly at centuries later. Born into generations of Habsburg inbreeding, his body was small, delicate, and prone to illness. He suffered from developmental delays, chronic weakness, and a jaw so pronounced it became almost emblematic of his family line. Yet, he was king, because bloodlines demanded it, and the human body, as it always does, endured, quietly, awkwardly, and sometimes painfully. Charles II wasn't alone. Many royal heirs were born fragile. Some had weak joints, poor vision, or chronic digestive issues. Some were intellectually delayed. Some were simply odd in ways that made portraits later amusing to the modern observer. And yet, the duties of royalty did not pause for frailty. Kings were expected to ride, hunt, negotiate, and appear strong before their courts. Queens were expected to bear heirs, manage households, and maintain decorum, even when exhaustion, illness, or chronic pain intervened. The human body, as delicate as it might be, was required to perform endlessly in service of dynasty and decorum. Strangely, this produced a kind of quiet absurdity. Courtiers recorded behaviors, habits, and appearances with gentle astonishment. Heirs who could barely stand were expected to joust. Noblewomen suffering from illness were required to attend dances. Kings with digestive complaints consumed lavish banquets for political appearances. And through it all, the human body persisted, comically fragile, yet stubbornly alive. Even minor bodily quirks could become politically significant. A visible deformity, chronic illness, or delayed development could affect marriage negotiations, alliances, or public perception. And yet, these bodies continued to function, slowly and unevenly under immense pressure. The endurance of royals was, in a way, spectacularly mundane, a mixture of resilience, discomfort, and unfortunate genetics. Let us consider royal childhoods for a moment. Princes and princesses were often spoiled, yet constantly scrutinized. Their diets, sleep patterns, and movements were monitored. Yet, fragile constitutions meant that even careful supervision could not prevent illness, accidents, or developmental challenges. Children endured lessons in diplomacy while simultaneously struggling to stand upright, chew solid foods, or survive minor fevers. Dynastic obsession with purity and succession amplified all of this. Families paired relatives deliberately, attempting to preserve bloodlines and power. But each generation compounded fragility, and each body became, in effect, an ongoing experiment. Which traits would persist, which weaknesses could be endured, which might quietly sabotage the kingdom. And yet, for all this fragility, the human body proved remarkably adaptable. Despite deformities, chronic illnesses, or eccentric habits, many royal figures survived decades. Some even produced heirs. Some navigated courts, wars, and ceremonies with a quiet determination that is